More than a decade after Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 vanished from radar shortly after taking off from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's Transport Ministry has now announced that
more than 12 years have passed since Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished from the sky on a clear March night in 2014, and yet the world still cannot look away. The case refuses to close. It refuses to settle into the comfortable category of a solved tragedy. Every few years, a new discovery, a new scientific paper, or a new search operation rips open the wound all over again, and each time, what emerges is not relief, but a deeper, stranger bewilderment. The latest chapters of this story, involving haunting underwater footage, barnacle forensics, contradicted theories, and a search effort that returned empty-handed yet again, have left investigators, scientists, and the families of 239 victims confronting an aftermath that almost nobody expected. This is not a story of closure. This is a story of how an airplane can still be the most confounding object on the planet, even after it has been swallowed by the sea. To understand why recent developments carry such weight, it is worth revisiting exactly what happened on the night of March 8, 2014. Flight MH370 was a Boeing 777-200ER, one of the most reliable and technologically sophisticated commercial aircraft ever built, operating a routine overnight journey from Kuala Lumpur International Airport to Beijing Capital International Airport. There were 239 people on board, 227 passengers and 12 crew members, representing nationalities from across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Families traveling on holiday, business passengers carrying laptops and agendas, young children with their whole lives ahead of them. For the first 40 minutes, everything was completely normal. Then, at 1:21 in the morning local time, the aircraft's transponder, the device that broadcasts a plane's identity and position to air traffic controllers, went silent. Just like that. No distress call. No alarm. No mechanical warning broadcast on any frequency. The aircraft simply vanished from civilian radar as if someone had reached up and switched it off. What followed was even more disturbing. Malaysian military radar, which operates independently of civilian systems, continued to track what appeared to be the aircraft as it turned sharply back across the Malay Peninsula and flew westward, a direction that made no navigational sense for a flight to Beijing. The plane crossed over the northern tip of Malaysia, flew out over the Andaman Sea, and then disappeared entirely from even military radar coverage. It was gone. Not crashed, not landed, not diverted to a known airport. Simply gone. The final confirmed communication between the crew and Malaysian air traffic control was a routine sign-off. "Good night, Malaysian 370, words that would later take on an unbearable significance. No one on the ground knew at that moment that they were the last words anyone outside that aircraft would ever hear from its crew. The plane flew on in silence for several more hours, tracked only by a series of faint automated satellite pings, handshake signals exchanged between the aircraft's communication system and an Inmarsat satellite. These pings, not designed as tracking tools, became the primary evidence used to reconstruct where the flight had gone. Analysts determined that the aircraft had flown south, deep into the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most remote and inhospitable stretches of water on Earth. The last of those satellite handshakes occurred at 8:19 in the morning, approximately 7 hours and 38 minutes after the transponder went dark. At that point, by any reasonable fuel calculation, the aircraft would have run out of fuel and descended into the ocean. But where exactly? That question has now consumed a decade of international scientific effort, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the emotional lives of hundreds of grieving families. For more than a year after the disappearance, there was nothing physical to confirm that MH370 had come down in the Indian Ocean at all. That changed in July 2015, when a beach cleaner on Réunion Island, a small French territory in the western Indian Ocean, stumbled upon a large, barnacle-encrusted piece of debris half buried in coastal sand. It was later identified as a flaperon, a hinged control surface from the wing of a Boeing 777. Malaysian aviation authorities confirmed it was consistent with components from flight MH370, making it the first tangible physical evidence ever recovered from the aircraft. Over the following years, more pieces surfaced. A wing flap fragment washed ashore in Tanzania. Sections of interior paneling were found in Madagascar. A horizontal stabilizer piece turned up in Mozambique. Fragments of the plane's engine cowling reached the coast of South Africa. By the most recent counts, more than 20 individual pieces of debris have been recovered or strongly suspected to be connected to MH370, scattered across thousands of kilometers of Indian Ocean coastline, from eastern Africa to islands far out at sea. The Indian Ocean's powerful and erratic currents had carried them in every direction. Each piece was scrutinized intensely by investigators. The condition of the debris told stories. Some surfaces showed smooth weathering consistent with prolonged ocean exposure, while others bore sharp, jagged tears suggesting catastrophic structural forces at the moment of impact. The flaperon, in particular, showed water impact marks on its trailing edge consistent with high-velocity contact with the ocean surface, though analysts disagreed about what exactly that implied about the final moments of the flight. Had the plane been under some form of control when it hit the water, or was it in a high-speed, uncontrolled dive? But the most extraordinary scientific development came not from the metal itself, it came from what was living on it. The flaperon recovered at Réunion Island was covered in barnacles, specifically a species known as Lepus anatifera, a stalked barnacle that colonizes floating debris in open ocean environments. Scientists recognized almost immediately that these barnacles could serve as biological flight recorders of a kind. The shells of Lepus anatifera grow in layers, incorporating oxygen isotopes from the surrounding seawater as they develop. Because ocean temperature varies by location and season, those isotope ratios essentially encode a chemical log of where the barnacle has been and when. In 2023, a research team led by scientists from the University of South Florida published a landmark study in the journal AGU Advances, presenting a new forensic method based on stable isotope analysis of the barnacles from the MH370 flaperon. By measuring the oxygen isotope ratios layer by layer through the barnacle shells, the researchers were able to reconstruct a partial drift trajectory, working backward from where the debris was found to where it likely originated. The results, while incomplete due to the relatively small size of the barnacles available for study, were consistent with a crash location along the so-called Seventh Arc, the curved region of the southern Indian Ocean defined by the satellite handshake data. However, the research team noted a critical limitation. The barnacles they had access to were relatively young and small, yielding only a partial chemical record. The older, larger barnacles, the ones that would contain the most complete record of where the debris had been, remained in the custody of French judicial authorities and had not been made available for scientific analysis. In a 2023 paper, lead researcher Gregory Herbert stated that if those larger barnacles were released for study, the method could potentially reconstruct the complete drift path all the way back to the crash site itself. That request remained unanswered as of mid-2026. A separate but related analysis published in early 2024 added another layer of complexity. Researchers studying the barnacle growth rates noted that the organisms on both the flaperon and at least one other piece of MH370 debris appeared to be only weeks old at the time the debris beached, far younger than the 16+ months that had elapsed since the crash. This finding, rather than invalidating the barnacle approach, suggested to some analysts that the debris may have spent most of its drift period in cooler temperate waters where barnacle colonization is inhibited, then entered warmer tropical waters only shortly before washing ashore, a pattern that would actually point toward a crash site in more tropical latitudes than the conventional southern Indian Ocean search zone. While scientists pursued the mystery through biology and oceanography, the official search effort entered a new and significant chapter. In March 2025, the Malaysian government signed a formal agreement with Ocean Infinity, a marine robotics company with operations in the United States and United Kingdom, to conduct a renewed search of the southern Indian Ocean seabed. The arrangement was structured on a strict no-find, no-fee basis. Ocean Infinity would receive a payment of $70 million if and only if it located substantial wreckage. If it came back empty-handed, it would receive nothing. Malaysia's Transport Minister Anthony Loke described the renewed commitment plainly. The government had a responsibility and obligation to the next of kin of those who had been aboard, and every credible lead had to be pursued. The search targeted a newly identified high-probability zone covering approximately 15,000 square kilometers in the southern Indian Ocean, a carefully selected area based on the most recent expert analysis incorporating updated drift modeling, satellite data reprocessing, and oceanographic simulation. Ocean Infinity deployed its search vessel, the Armada 7806, along with a team of autonomous underwater vehicles, robotic submarines capable of operating independently at extreme depths without any direct tether to a surface ship. The search was conducted in 2 phases. The first phase ran from late February through the end of March 2025. The second phase ran from the final days of December 2025 through January 23, 2026. Combined, the operation covered approximately 7,571 square kilometers of seabed across 28 operational search days. And then, on March 8, 2026, the 12th anniversary of the disappearance, Malaysia's Air Accident Investigation Bureau delivered the news that families had dreaded. The search had concluded. The new zone had been exhaustively surveyed. No wreckage had been found. Once again, the southern Indian Ocean had given up nothing. Ocean Infinity departed the search area and set course for Singapore, stating that while this phase was ending, its commitment to finding the aircraft was not over. Since its first MH370 search effort in 2018, the company had now mapped more than 140,000 square kilometers of southern Indian Ocean seafloor, an area the size of a small country, and found no confirmed trace of the plane. The families responded with a mixture of grief and continued resolve. The advocacy group Voice 370, representing next of kin from multiple countries, continued to push for further searches, refusing to accept the accumulation of dead ends as a final verdict. For many of them, the absence of the aircraft is not merely a mystery, it is an ongoing injustice, a wound that cannot begin to heal without physical confirmation of what happened. Even as the 2025 search was getting underway, the scientific understanding of MH370's final moments was being directly challenged in peer-reviewed literature. In December 2024, retired University of Tasmania scientist Vincent Line published a paper in the Journal of Navigation that confronted one of the foundational assumptions of the entire investigation. The prevailing theory, built on years of satellite data analysis by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and various international teams, held that MH370 had run out of fuel sometime around 8:19 a.m. on March 8, 2014, and then entered a rapid, uncontrolled, high-speed dive into the southern Indian Ocean. This death dive interpretation had shaped all major search decisions for years. Line argued, using a detailed reanalysis of the final two satellite signals exchanged between the aircraft and the Inmarsat satellite at 019 Universal Time Coordinated, that those communications were actually more consistent with a controlled, eastward descent, not the northwest to south trajectory and rapid uncontrolled fall that official searchers had long assumed. In his paper, Line described the prevailing interpretation as fundamentally flawed, arguing that the satellite frequency data could support a scenario in which someone was actively piloting the aircraft during its final descent, and that the endpoint may have been significantly different from the area that had been searched so intensively. This was not a fringe claim. The Journal of Navigation is a peer-reviewed publication of the Royal Institute of Navigation, and Line's analysis engaged seriously with the technical satellite data at the core of the investigation. Whether his conclusions ultimately prove correct remains unresolved. Other analysts in the MH370 research community have disputed his reading of the data, but the paper underscored a troubling reality. More than a decade on, experts still cannot fully agree on what the available evidence actually means. A parallel line of scientific inquiry focused on underwater acoustics. A study published in May 2024 in the journal Scientific Reports examined whether a large aircraft impacting the ocean surface could generate hydroacoustic signals, essentially underwater sound waves, detectable by monitoring stations thousands of kilometers away. Analysts reviewed archived acoustic data from deep ocean hydrophone stations near the estimated time of MH370's disappearance. One potentially relevant signal was identified at one of the two stations considered, but the researchers stopped well short of claiming it pointed to a definitive crash location. Instead, they proposed that controlled experiments, including detonations along the seventh arc, could help calibrate whether such acoustic signals can be reliably traced back to an aircraft impact. That work remained ongoing. What all of this means, taken together, is that the footage being referenced in recent coverage, both the sonar imagery from undersea surveys and the acoustic and satellite data visualizations generated by these new analyses, does not tell a simple story. It does not reveal a neat crash site with recoverable wreckage and answers waiting to be read. Instead, it reveals the scale of what remains unknown, and the unsettling possibility that the search has been looking in a place that is wrong. There is a tendency, in coverage of MH370, to focus on the technical dimensions of the mystery, the satellite pings, the drift models, the acoustic signals, and to treat the human dimension as a backdrop. But the human dimension is the reason any of this matters, and it is the reason the story will not end no matter how many search efforts come back empty. The 239 people aboard flight MH370 came from at least 14 countries. The majority, 153, were Chinese nationals. Dozens were Malaysian. There were passengers from Indonesia, Australia, India, France, the United States, Canada, and New Zealand, among others. They ranged from a 2-year-old child traveling with her family to elderly grandparents, from artists and engineers to military personnel and academics. Each of them was someone's anchor in the world. Each of their absences left behind a specific, irreplaceable void. For their families, the official conclusion, contained in a 495-page report released by Malaysian investigators in 2018, offered little that could be called comfort. The report acknowledged that the aircraft's controls were likely deliberately manipulated to take it off course. It acknowledged that someone redirected the plane. But it stopped short of identifying who was responsible, or why, or what ultimately happened to the people on board. The investigators said explicitly that drawing any firm conclusion required finding the wreckage, and the wreckage had not been found. The families have spent 12 years suspended in that uncertainty, which is its own particular form of suffering. No confirmed site of death, no physical remains for most families, no clear account of what the people they loved experienced in those final hours. The cruel arithmetic of the situation means that for many, grief cannot be fully processed, because the loss itself has never been confirmed in the way that human psychology requires for mourning to proceed. What the latest footage and the latest failed search have given them is not answers. It is the knowledge that the world has not stopped trying, that scientists are analyzing barnacles under microscopes, that robotics engineers are sending autonomous vehicles to depths of more than 4 kilometers, that researchers are poring over satellite frequency data and acoustic recordings in an effort to reinterpret the small quantity of evidence that exists. It is, in the absence of resolution, at least the evidence of continued commitment. As of mid-2026, the question of what happens next in the search for MH370 has no definitive answer. Ocean Infinity has stated it has not abandoned the effort, but no new search mission has been formally announced. The Malaysian government has expressed continued willingness to pursue credible leads, though the financial and logistical constraints of open ocean deep-sea search operations are severe. Independent researchers around the world continue to publish analyses, debate locations, and challenge assumptions. The barnacle research offers perhaps the most intriguing near-term possibility for progress. If French judicial authorities were to release the largest, oldest barnacle specimens from the Réunion Island Flaperon for scientific study, the stable isotope drift reconstruction method developed at the University of South Florida could potentially yield a significantly more precise crash location estimate, potentially narrowing the search zone dramatically. Whether that release will happen remains unknown. Vincent Line's controlled descent hypothesis, if it were to gain traction among a broader community of analysts, could shift the entire geographic framework of the search. If the aircraft did not enter a rapid uncontrolled dive but instead descended under some form of guidance toward a different endpoint, years of search effort may have been concentrated in the wrong part of the ocean. That possibility is deeply uncomfortable, but it is supported by a peer-reviewed scientific argument that has not been refuted. The hydroacoustic research, still in its early stages, could eventually provide an entirely independent means of identifying the crash zone if controlled experiments confirm the method's reliability. What the story of MH370 ultimately tells us, through all its satellite data and barnacle chemistry and robotic submersibles and grieving families, is something about the nature of the ocean itself, and about the limits of what technology can guarantee us. We live in an era when a package shipped across the world can be tracked in real time, when a photograph taken on a phone can be geolocated to within a few meters, when satellites map the surface of Mars in detail. And yet a Boeing 777, carrying 239 human beings, entered the southern Indian Ocean 12 years ago and has not been found. That is not a small fact. It is one of the defining mysteries of our time. And until the aircraft is located, until the black box data, if it still exists, is recovered and read, until the families who have waited more than a decade finally receive something resembling a truthful account of what happened on that night, the story of flight MH370 will continue to demand attention, resist simple conclusions, and remind the world that the ocean keeps its secrets on its own terms.